Army says it's gained control of the key city of Volnovakha after intense fighting. Much of the area is in ruins as residents try to cope with the losses of their loved ones.
Она с бабушка лежачая, и она задохнулась, мы не могли туда пройти. Целые сутки. Похоронить мы тоже хоронили под взрывами, под пулями.
The town of Shasty has been under the control of Kiev's forces for 8 years, but now the front line moved further away and life here is getting back to normal.
RT's Maria Fanoshina visits a Donetsk Republic town recently reclaimed by the local military after heavy fighting. She takes a look at how residents are trying to return to a peaceful life after 8 years of violence from the Ukrainian military. Petrol prices in the US have soared following a ban on Russian energy imports by the White House, leaving some Americans struggling to keep their vehicles on the road.
This is just ridiculous. It's crazy.
It does have a severe impact, economic impact on a lot of people.
The price goes up, and it's just really hitting people in the pocketbook.
Hello and welcome to RT International. My name is Paula Slayer and we're coming to you live from our studios in Moscow. Thank you for joining us. Now, the conflict in Ukraine is raging on with unrelenting battles between Russian-led forces and retreating Ukrainian troops now well into their third week. Let's recap some of the latest developments from the war zone. The UN says more than 2.5 million people have fled Ukraine since the conflict erupted last month, and another 2 million are considered internally displaced. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says the humanitarian situation appears to be rapidly deteriorating, and he hopes for substantial progress in peace talks with Russia. Western powers have imposed unprecedented economic sanctions against Moscow, as the EU's foreign policy chief says the bloc is opting for economic pressure over military intervention. Meanwhile, Turkey and Israel are acting as mediators, seeking to facilitate a diplomatic solution to the conflict. Donetsk and Lugansk Republic forces are continuing their advance in eastern Ukraine, with the local army saying they've retaken more residential areas from Ukrainian forces. Civilians who've been caught in the crossfire have been forced to live without access to basic supplies while hiding in shelters from the ongoing hostilities. The small city of Volnovakha is the latest location to be retaken by Donbas forces with help from the Russian military after days of fierce battles with entrenched Ukrainian troops. The city's infrastructure and buildings have taken a heavy toll, with many damaged or completely destroyed, while the majority of residents were forced to abandon their homes, often having to tragically leave behind relatives who could not make the move.
Вот на втором этаже наша квартира. На первом этаже фуганули фугасную бомбу. Загорелась квартира. Она с бабушка лежачая. И она задохнулась, мы не могли туда пройти. Целые сутки стреляли везде, вот, смотрите. Мы сидели в подвалах, ходили вокруг, стреляли. Могли выйти больше суток. Потом я подошла к солдатам, говорю, мальчики, у меня там мама лежачая, могу я не могу зайти. Не пошли, правда, ребята хотели вытащить ее в подвал. Ну, мы же уже умерла. Похоронить мы тоже хоронили под взрывами, под пулями.
The Donetsk Republic's government says the Ukrainian forces used civilians as human shields during the battle for Volnovakha. Ukrainians have been accused of placing their firing positions inside a local hospital and opening fire while civilians were still inside.
Наличие зданий больницы, выстрелов и, собственно, патронов и других боеприпасов говорит о том, что здесь оборонялись нацисты, что они использовали этот объект как живой щит. Это если вернуться опять же к поставкам наших замечательных партнеров, да, вот, пожалуйста, маркировка, обратите внимание. Вот, вели огонь как раз, опять же, из этого здания больницы.
The founder of the Donetsk military brigade, called Vostok, has explained how exactly the Ukrainian military has been abusing the notorious tactic of human shields.
For example, we took up position in some part of the house. The enemy sends the tank out of neighboring residential buildings and fires directly at us. Teams in 2 tanks that know the area can calmly control 2 blocks, knowing the streets, knowing the ways through. At the same time, they have shelters. They use both kindergartens and schools. To deal with this, we have to take some measures. And even if we use precision destruction, we know that people have left the upper floors, they are in basements, the buildings are empty, no one lives in them. Before we work with a building, we fly drones right to the windows and take a precise look, to make sure that there are definitely no people there.
Meanwhile, we spoke to a man who says mortar fire directly hit and killed his wife as she walked to get humanitarian aid in the southern city of Mariupol. She was reportedly torn to pieces by the strike. He and his son were wounded. With residents close to starvation, the family had been walking to get deliveries of flour.
Сказали, соседи проходили мимо, что в школе гуманитарную помощь выдают. Погода была хорошая, решили воздухом подышать, как раз заодно в школу пройтись, получить 2 ковшика муки. Когда подходили, прямо на входе, на центральном, прямо у нас прилетел снаряд. Мы шли втроем, жена, ребенок посередине, я слева. Снаряд с правой стороны прилетел, получается, что прямо в нее. Нас с ребенком отбросило. Когда я пришел в себя, там в течение нескольких секунд, звон в ушах, контузия, я кинулся к ним, ребенок кричит. Я его схватил и увидел, что ей уже не помочь. Продолжился обстрел, прямо в это же место начали еще прилетать снаряды. Мы с ним скатились, я его схватил, мы скатились за ступеньки, спрятались. Прилетели еще несколько снарядов, потом схватил, перебежали чуть дальше, опять снаряды стали прилетать. В общем, школу обстреливали очень сильно. Потом за деревьями чуть дальше отбежали, спрятались. Потом вроде чуть прекратилось, я его схватил, оббежал школу вокруг, я знал, где убежище. В убежище забежал, стал вопить, что там моя жена, хотя я понимал, что, скорее всего, ей уже не помочь, но тем не менее. Но они даже выйти не смогли, потому что обстрел продолжался.
Unfortunately, the humanitarian situation to deteriorate rapidly, and in some cities it has reached catastrophic proportions. Armed nationalist groups are planting mines in residential areas, destroying bridges and roads, and destroying critical infrastructure. As a result of these criminal and treacherous actions by the Ukrainian authorities, primarily affecting their own people, the civilian population has been forced to endure inhumane conditions, without heat, electricity, fresh water, food and medicine. People are on the verge of despair, and Kiev, knowing the true situation on the ground, continues cynically, through the Ukrainian media, to claim that these are allegedly the results of actions by the Russian armed forces, while all these atrocities, the mines, explosions, the firing on residential neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, kindergartens, occur in front of living witnesses who sooner or later will tell the world the entire truth of this tragedy.
Territories liberated by Donbas and Russian forces have started to rebuild after heavy attacks from Ukraine. These are some of the latest pictures from a town in the Lugansk region, where streets are being cleared of rubble. Ukrainian flags are also being removed from administrative buildings. Residents of areas retaken by Lugansk forces are trying to return to a peaceful life, rebuilding their streets and homes after 8 years of a simmering conflict with the Ukrainian military. RT's Maria Fanoshina reports from the scene.
For this town north of Lugansk, it seems the worst could finally be over.
Means happiness in English.
Just a week ago, we were here, filming colossal destruction. A front line, it became the scene of fierce fighting after days of constant shelling. Now, several teams are working hard to remove the debris. Electricity, water and gas are back. People are slowly returning home.
The town of Shasty has been under the control of Kiev's forces for 8 years, but now the front line moved further away and life here is getting back to normal. And finally, there is time for things like this.
The yellow and blue Ukrainian flag seems to be a symbol of everything that they are fighting against here. The Lugansk Republic authorities do not yet hang their official symbols instead, but they seem to be impatient to get rid of anything that could remind them of the last 8 years. With flags down, Ukraine's official colors are still everywhere. Removing memories of the past is important, but building bridges to the future is even more so.
Just days ago, Russia's defense ministry reported that Ukraine's armed forces, while retreating, blew up one section of this bridge outside the town of Shastia and also left lots of explosives to cut the enemy off. And now you can see it's reinforced, fixed and opened for military and for civilians as well.
As we film on the bridge, a large group of workers arrive.
Скажите, а что вы делаете?
Свет, освещение моста. Здесь будут они лежат столбы, и будут лампы стоять здесь, осветительные.
The pace of reconstruction here is astonishing. Things seem to get fixed in next to no time, but broken hearts and lives will take much longer to reheal. Marie Vinoshna, RT, from the Lugansk Republic.
Meanwhile, some local emergency services personnel are reported to have left the Ukrainian side to join the Donbas forces, including 80 rescue workers who, together with their boss, have expressed solidarity with the Donetsk People's Republic. We caught up with some of them.
This is our land. People here are my second family. We are on duty around the clock. We were born here. I could not afford to leave.
I love my job. I love working in this service. I want to continue working here. We have no difficulties at all.
And here you can see the latest map of Ukraine, with territories under the control of the Russian-led forces marked in red. Some of the most intense fighting right now is in the Kharkov and Kiev regions, as the Russian military pushes onwards, trying to cause as little collateral damage as possible. Huge columns of smoke have been seen rising up near Kiev, with some Ukrainian military facilities under attack there. The Ukrainian side is said to be setting up firing positions from among residential areas, with locals forced to take shelter in their basements.
Where can we go? We don't have a place to go to. We have 2 children. Here we are underground, we have food supplies, and even if we go to stay somewhere for a couple of days, then what's next?
Of course it is scary, especially at night. We are hanging in there and we have no other option.
Ukraine calls Russia's military actions an unprovoked invasion, calling for the immediate withdrawal of Russian forces. Moscow says its operation is aimed at protecting the people of Donbas from the Ukrainian military. Meanwhile, hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers have reportedly surrendered to advancing Donbas and Russian army forces. We heard from some of them currently in custody.
I've seen my fellow soldiers doing drugs. We've also been drinking several times. We shelled residential areas in the Lugansk region, though we knew civilians were there. They just ordered to do it and fire in that direction.
We got anti-tank missile launchers from Britain. They just sent us videos and instructions, but I didn't understand how to use them. They said Russian soldiers are like butchers, they deliberately intimidated us. But now I see this is not true. We were used as human shields, that's it. They knew how the operation was going and they just moved away the troops that were supposed to help us.
The United Nations says more than 2.5 million Ukrainians have fled the country since the war erupted 2 weeks ago, while more than 2 million people have been internally displaced. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky says safe evacuation routes are being established.
All the humanitarian corridors that were agreed upon worked. We managed to take out 12,729 people today. Humanitarian cargo for Mariupol should arrive tomorrow afternoon because of the complexity of the route. We had to spend the night in Berdyansk.
Russian servicemen have delivered more than 40 tons of humanitarian aid to residents in the Kiev region. The district is now under Russian military control. Aid brought to the settlements includes food and basic necessities. Joe Biden is allocating another $200 million of military aid for Ukraine, just days after the State Department shut down proposals to send fighter jets, with a warning that direct U.S. action in the conflict would lead to World War III. Washington previously said last month that it was sending $350 million of military equipment to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Georgia, which, like Ukraine, borders Russia, is to hold military drills and computer-assisted exercises with NATO this month. The exercises will start on March the 20th and span 5 days, with a goal to develop operational and planning skills as Georgia seeks to integrate closer with the Western alliance. Moscow has long condemned NATO's eastward expansion as a threat to its national security. Independent journalist Martin Summers says Georgia should think twice before hosting NATO troops.
There's been links between the conflicts in Georgia and Ukraine going back to the 2008 conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which was initiated by the Georgians. I mean, the 2008 Georgian conflict initiated by the Georgians' attempt to retake the breakaway republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And of course, the Russian response to that was quite decisive. So Saakashvili then lost power in Georgia and, of course, reappeared in Ukraine. The Western strategy is to use conflicts on the borders of Russian Federation to destabilize not just the government of Russia. It looks as if the actual goal is to destabilize the Russian state, which is a pretty absurd goal, frankly, given the circumstances. If you're in charge in Georgia, you've got to think, well, you know, how can NATO actually protect you if the Russians decided that they're not happy with what you're doing? You've got that it's much more difficult for NATO forces to access Georgia than it is to access Ukraine, and it's quite clear that NATO isn't prepared to go to war over Ukraine. So why do the Georgian leadership imagine that they're going to be under some kind of protection if they engage in this kind of provocative, conflict stoking?